Thanks very much, and it's good that those of you who've struggled through the beach in the east to be with us this morning. I think what we're doing this morning is really essential because there's a need for a sort of generalist approach, a holistic interdisciplinary approach to some of these key questions. So thank you very much for inviting us and for hosting this. Really what I want to do is to try and describe the project I've been involved in the last 8 years and cover some of it for those of you who aren't familiar with it, but not bore those of you who are over familiar with it. It really started in 2007 with a simple question, which was, why don't we eat food from near where we live? That's what most people in the world do to this day, and it's what we have done until very recently. And asking that really simple question provoked a huge response in terms of incredulity from mainstream society and media, and a yearning to explore that question from hundreds and then thousands of people. But interestingly, from that simple question in 2007, why don't we eat food from near where we live? We find ourselves in 2015, as the project closes, asking a different question, which is, how do you create a sustainable food system in an unsustainable economy? So we entered the door with a really simple question about localism, and we exit the door with a question about a kind of multiple crisis of health, environment, and economy, as systems and structures that we thought were enduring and supporting are collapsing and failing around us. I think in terms of the wider questions that we were asked to chip in at the beginning, I would add 3 more. I would add food as the ultimate precarity, the precarious society. Food is the linchpin of that precarity, whether that's in time, in stress, or in environmental load. I would answer a second one, food as a form of social control. Because as we see a growing inequality in our world, food is at the absolute centre of that. I had the displeasure to be in a supermarket the other day, and I saw adverts urging people to buy certain items for food banks. There's adverts in magazines saying this would be a good thing if you're thinking about buying something for a food bank. And it's extraordinary how the culture of food banks and extreme poverty and hunger has suddenly become a mainstream reality in the 21st century Britain. I would, on a more hopeful note, add a third overarching question, and that is food as restorative practice. I'm going to have to sort of juggle between 2 machines here, so this might be slightly odd. So what I want to do this morning, and leave lots of space for discussion, because I think there's incredible knowledge in this room, and we need to share that. But I want to briefly say something about what we did, the Fife diet as a bioregional response to climate change, as a community response to climate change. Why did we do it? What was our motivations? And what was the motivations of our members? What worked? And what now? Where are we? And how did we succeed and fail? So we started with a fundamental sense that there was something wrong with the food system that wasn't going to be fixed by charging 5 pence for a plastic bag. Something much more deep-seated was wrong. But we also started with a sense that there was something that we could do about it. So I think that was important to keep a deep sense of unease or the profound level of the crisis, but also a sense of agency and motivation and response. That was key to us. We sourced food only from Fife for the first year and then created what we called an 80-20 approach, following growing communities in London, where we could say to our members and people we were trying to entice onto the project, see if you can source 80% of your food locally and 20% that you couldn't possibly grow or produce in your area from elsewhere. We conceived eating locally and creating a sustainable food system as an act of climate justice, as an act of solidarity. Other peoples from outside perceived it as an act of parochialism, but that was what was going through our mind. So we developed from an informal network, and when I say an informal network, I mean me and my wife and my 2 children, to a growing movement over the next few years. We began to map the food region to figure out where we lived and what it could grow, and break through a kind of cultural self-hatred about our own food, which I think is particularly strong in Scotland. We then started publishing carbon footprint reports on our research volunteers, and now for all of our members, which is about 6,500 across the region. We aim to deliver stronger communities through an enhanced local economy, healthier unprocessed fresh food, and food with lower carbon impact. So that's what we thought we were doing. This is a map that some of you will be familiar with, which reflects this 80-20 concept. This was developed by growing communities in London, and it gives some sense of steering decision-making about what's appropriate to be sourced locally at an urban or a peri-urban level, and what is appropriate to be sourced from the rest of the UK, the rest of Europe or beyond. I think it's important that you navigate through the issues of localism and localism's role in sustainable food with some more sophisticated thinking. We deliberately started the project by saying, why don't we eat food from somewhere near where we live? As a simple question, but we know that we're navigating through into complexity as we approach these issues. Here's one of our members relaxing at an early meeting, and we asked people to commit to the project by suggesting 6 actions that they could take in behaviour change. To eat more locally, which we defined regionally or bioregionally, to eat less meat and different kinds of meat, to eat more organic food, to reduce food waste, to compost more, and to grow some of their own food. People were then able to make some choices about that, and that was key because what we were offering was a template, but not a template that was so directional that people felt they were being told what to do. Instead, they were given an offering and people could make appropriate choices. So what has worked in our project? Actually, the most fundamental thing was preparing, sharing and eating food together, which I think just taps into some basic human need, and that was the building block, the methodology for building our project in local halls, village halls throughout Fife, where we would cook for 40, 50, 60, 70 people, eat together and share our conversation about food and climate. I think we were lucky that this project arrived at the same time as social media, so we were able to document the project and create a network, but we became very clear there's a difference between building a network and building a community. And a lot of the time we are all, I suspect, guilty of collectivism, where we are liking and sharing ideas and thinking that we are participating in some meaningful change, when in fact we're just part of a network. So I think a network that responds to a real live community with live events has real strength and vitality, and that's what we tried to build. But the building blocks of that was really cooking food, preparing food and sharing food together. We then began to map the carbon footprint and the impact of what we were doing to see if it made any difference. And we'll be publishing the full carbon impact report of 8 years' work next month. But in all the complexity, some simple facts emerged that our members had a carbon footprint average about 50% below the UK average. Some much more, but that's how it averaged out. And that's interesting because these are people working within the existing structures. This is people making individual and neighbourhood and community changes without basically anything changing in the wider infrastructure. We know also that our members have an average of about 7 portions of fruit and veg a day, between 7 and 9, so considerably more. So when we first started, the media were extremely sceptical and thought that we might die of malnutrition or scurvy, and that didn't happen. We also know about our members in this response to Pete's point about gender. We know that about 70% of our membership are women. And that tells you something about, I think, two things. One, that women probably are still the key decision-making people about shopping, what comes into the household. And two, we found that a lot of people were being motivated when they had young children. And if you look at the growth of organic foods for babies, for example, it's absolutely huge. I think people get politicised around food when they have small children. Yeah, I think this is probably more colour than really a major point, but I do think that there's something interesting about how fundamentally disconnected we are from land and from place and from the environment and from seasonality and from where our food comes from at all. It miraculously appears at a very cheap price. And I think one of the things that we noticed was this yearning for community, this yearning for people eating together, and the growth of the wild food movement. I think you can see as people trying to reconnect with something, trying to find a way back to some kind of connection with place, with seasonality and reskilling and knowledge. We then operated not just in Fife, but throughout the whole of Scotland. We have an offshoot project called the Seed Truck, whose slogan is "Sowing the Seeds of a Better Food System," and that operated at a national level. And this is a project just outside Aberdeen. It did work in community centres and schools, creating simple opportunities for people to grow their own food. One of the kind of focal points for the local food movement has been the Abundance Project and the growth of apple days as people begin to reconnect specifically with seasonality. And it's interesting because if you think of apples, particularly in Scotland, they are sort of an interesting point because it's impossible to walk into any shop in Scotland and buy an apple that's grown here. It's virtually impossible. I'd love it if somebody could put their hand up and say, no, you're wrong, I can do that somewhere in the country. And we need to think about who stole our orchards and who stole our food culture, and why that is the case. Because we import apples from New Zealand. It's a bizarre thing to do when only 100 years ago or so we had a vast array of apples and a great orchard culture. So it's both a problem and a community level response that a group are now looking at how they can up from these kind of apple days on a very small scale that play an important role, but how they can up that to a different level that's actually about produce and creating opportunities. So the Seed Truck, I mentioned the Seed Truck project. Here it is in Glasgow. It's run by a colleague of mine, Fergus Walker. We created something called the Seed Kist, which you see here, which offered, it's like open source seeds, basically, that are designed for a Scottish climate. And this has been very popular at some of our events. We try to create opportunities for people to get excited about local food and food production. This is our festival smoothie bike on your left, and that's working at Inverkeithing High School on the right. As we tried to develop the project, we made connections with other people in different parts of the world. This is at the Tipperary, where we helped launch the Tipperary diet, and this is an FE college where they created a huge dining table down the corridors. And we've connected also with groups like Specia Locale in Austria, who are our sister project there. It's interesting in terms of the Irish experience and whether this is mirrored in other parts of Europe or whether it's mirrored here. Some of the Irish colleagues that we spoke to said that the idea of reconnecting with the land was something that lots of Irish people didn't want to do because they'd only recently got off the land, and actually being reconnected with the land was something of a sign of being backward or rural. So it's interesting how these stories and these narratives about our own place are fed through and how that's experienced here. One of the things we tried to do is break through what we think is a real problem of cultural self-hatred around food in Scotland. When we have government ministers championing the salmon industry, the farm salmon industry, or food exports, we often hear them say other things about our endemic health problems. And what we wanted to do was to try and celebrate seasonality and what we can actually grow here and try and reclaim some of that food heritage. See, in this picture we've got some fruit at the top, because the question we were asked very early on was, what do you do for fruit? With people sort of incredulous. And this is interesting because Scotland's actually the largest producer of soft fruit in Europe. But I think what people now think of as fruit, what they mean is tropical fruit. What the question means is, how will you get your pineapples and your mangoes? And so we tried to celebrate what we can grow here, which obviously is raspberries, strawberries, and a whole range of local fruits. So there's an element of reskilling and celebration in all of this. So that's a brief update on what we did. Why did we do this? Well, fundamentally, we were motivated by the climate crisis. The challenge not just of our generation, but of our species. We have breached 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere for the first time in 3 million years. And that simple fact should motivate all of our social policy. All of our economic thinking should be focused around that single fact, that single undeniable statement. Our society and our culture should be redirected around this alone. But we begin to discover how dysfunctional our food system is. It's been disclosed in the last 2 years, for example, that we waste, both in production and consumption, 50% of our food in the UK. Food banks that we'll talk about, I'm sure, throughout the day have boomed 300% in Scotland in the last year alone. This is a catastrophic failure of political leadership, and that is what motivated us. I think also it's worth putting the food crisis that we see culminating and merging in the last year and becoming much more clear to us in some historical context. So in 1962, I think, Rachel Carson wrote The Silent Spring, which many people see as the kind of starting point of the modern environmental movement. This was the notion that the impact of pesticides on the songbird population would create a silent spring. And sadly, much of what she envisaged then has come true. 2 or 3 years earlier, Murray Bookchin wrote The Problem of Chemicals in Our Food, a much more radical but less poetic piece. But you could see people beginning to grapple with this issue in the late 50s and 60s. And we should always remember that the world's worst environmental disaster at Bhopal was a plant run by Union Carbide that was creating pesticides and insecticides for use in our agricultural system. So the crisis of food and the crisis of environment are on a twin track, and we can see that for 40, 50, 60 years. As we've gone on during that time, this notion of crisis and response has developed, and we can see this discussion becoming much more articulate and much more radical. We can see the Italian Carlo Petrini's slow food movement that started in the 70s. We can see people like José Bové, the French farmer who created the concept of malbouffe, bad food. The guy who dumped his manure on McDonald's said this food is rubbish, this food is... So we have those responses, and then we have, more recently, we have the popular film Food Inc. that looks at the crisis of the industrialised food system, or Raj Patel, who looks at the notion of stuffed and starved, the fact that we have a reality where 1 billion people are malnourished in the world at the same time as 1 billion people are suffering from obesity. And that is the outcome of our current food system. And then we have the slightly more poetic Michael Pollan, who's trying to create sort of aphorisms around food and help us in understanding ways forward. So the local food movement has emerged over the last 5 or 10 years as notions of food sovereignty and food security have gone on. But they've happened in the context, particularly in Britain, of almost annual disasters and exposes of the level of dysfunctionality in the system. So when people say to me, well, how did you create the Fife Diet? How did you build the movement? You sort of think, well, not with any great difficulty, because every year the system throws up some kind of crisis, and we can see that year in, year out, ongoing. It's not difficult to invite people to want to know where their food comes from. We can see with last year's and the year before's horse meat scandal that the concept of provenance has gone from being a sort of chefy issue that you might see on the telly to one of public interest. So we've tried to do this work in the context of community building and in the context of a regional response to climate change. But we've also developed some policy tools, and we created a food manifesto, 20 ways to change the way we do food. And we are trying to take that forward to influence Scottish Government policy. There was the person who mentioned, how does this work in a devolved context? I think that's a really interesting question that we should explore more, and one that's been bust open in terms of the GM issue because of recent European law changes. So I won't take you through the 20 policy ideas, but just mention 2 or 3 of them. The soup test is our idea that children shouldn't leave school in Scotland until they're able to make a pot of soup. You shouldn't actually be able to leave school and go out into the world until you can make a pot of soup for your classmates or your teachers. People are locked into fast food and de-skilled, and we need to help equip people with some basic cooking skills and life skills. This would be inexpensive and is an essential. Sounds like a bit of a silly idea, but I think it's actually an essential idea. At the moment in Scotland we have something called a cooking bus that drives around Scotland. This is one bus that drives around teaching people how to cook food. This is regularly lauded by the Scottish Government, and it's a bit of a joke really. What we need is ambitious pan-Scotland approaches with some simple ideas, and we think a soup test would be a good one. We also need a moratorium on building more supermarkets in this country, because the grip on retail that about 4 companies has on our shopping experience is completely unacceptable. And I think that the role of supermarkets in our society needs to be questioned. I'm in an unfortunate position where, at the moment, Tesco's in Kirkcaldy is going to be earmarked for closure. And we were asked to defend Tesco's, and it's something we won't do. It's going to lose about 179 jobs in the town, and it's a disaster for a town that is already on its uppers. But the idea that you would defend an economic model that shafts farmers, creates bad processed food, and creates low-paid, low-skilled, temporary part-time jobs is something that we should defend, is just such a scraping the barrel for me that I don't think we should do it. I think we need to be more ambitious, looking at different economic models than just feeding that beast. The reason Tesco is closing is because, as you know, they have completely botched their own accounts, have massive fines, and they're under pressure from, in Kirkcaldy's terms, Lidl, Sainsbury's, and a brand new Morrison's. But I think it's a real question about how we do shopping, how we experience food, and who's in control of that. The other policy that I'd mention is the soda tax, which is an idea that we take a small percentage cut from the sale of the fizzy drinks and then plough that back into some healthy eating projects, some educational projects, whether that's the soup test, whether that's community food and health, whether that's Nourish, whether that's some of these amazing food projects that have grown up, I don't know. But we need to begin to take on those kind of challenges. I'm really hoping that we can have some discussion about this, and I do think that we need to connect the bigger picture of how we create a sustainable food system with an unsustainable economy. There are extraordinary accounts coming out of what's been described as a public health emergency. This is emerging as Britain's coalition government austerity measures are beginning to hit home. And the real picture of this is only beginning to sink home. Charlie Cooper, writing for The Independent, has written of a public health emergency declared as 1 in 6 GPs was asked to refer a patient to food banks in the last year. A Scottish Government report has identified welfare reform, benefit delays, benefit sanctions and falling incomes as the main drivers of demand. The UK Government's own report on food banks was delayed for months after it was completed amid accusations that ministers suppressed the findings. These are reforms imposed by a government we didn't elect, holding values we don't share. So while I think that the issue of food sovereignty is absolutely essential in this debate, so too is the issue of sovereignty for them. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope we can have some discussion about these issues. Thank you.